I never intended to return to Black Hollow. It was the kind of place that haunted you long after you'd left, the kind of place that you only visited in nightmares. But when my childhood friend, Derek, called me out of the blue after 15 years and invited me back for a weekend at his family's old cabin, something in me couldn't resist. Maybe it was nostalgia, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was just the eerie pull that Black Hollow had always had over me. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it, nestled deep in the woods, with its wooden beams and stone foundation blending into the thick forest that surrounded it. The trees were tall and dense, blocking out most of the sunlight, and the air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. As we approached, a cold wind cut through the trees, making the cabin's windows rattle like they were shivering from the cold. "You've really kept this place looking good," I said to Derek as we pulled our bags from the car. He grinned. "It's my dad's legacy. I couldn't let it rot." We stepped inside, and a wave of nostalgia hit me hard. The old fireplace, the creaky floorboards, the worn-out leather chairs, all of it felt like a time capsule from our childhood. But there was something else too, a feeling I couldn't quite shake, like the air inside the cabin was too still, too quiet. I glanced at Derek, but he seemed unfazed, busy unpacking. We spent the first evening catching up, reminiscing about old times. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows on the walls, and for a while I forgot about the unease that had settled in my chest. But as the night grew darker, that feeling returned. It was subtle at first, a low hum of anxiety in the back of my mind. But by the time we'd finished dinner, it had become a gnawing sense of dread. "You remember the stories about this place, don't you?" Derek asked suddenly, his voice low. I looked at him, surprised. "You mean the ones we made up as kids? The ghost stories?" He shook his head. "Not those. The real stories. The ones our parents wouldn't tell us." A chill ran down my spine. I had always suspected there was more to Black Hollow than the silly tales we'd spun as kids, but I had never pressed for details. "There's something wrong about this place," Derek continued, his eyes fixed on the fire. "My dad used to say the land here was cursed, that strange things happened in these woods. People went missing, animals found torn apart, weird noises at night." I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the growing tension. "Come on, you're just trying to freak me out." But Derek wasn't smiling. His face was pale, his expression deadly serious. "I'm not joking, man," he said quietly. "There's something here, something old and angry. My dad used to hear it at night, something moving in the woods, watching the cabin." I glanced out the window at the thick wall of trees surrounding us, suddenly aware of how isolated we were. The wind howled outside, making the trees sway and creak like ancient bones. "What kind of something?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Derek hesitated before answering. He never knew for sure. He called it the Watcher, said it would come close at night, scratching at the walls, but it never tried to come inside. A cold sweat broke out across my skin. I wanted to laugh it off, to call him crazy, but the way he was looking at me, the sincerity in his voice, made it impossible. That night, I lay awake in the small, musty bedroom, listening to the wind battering the cabin. The bed creaked beneath me as I tossed and turned, unable to shake Derek's words from my mind. The Watcher. What the hell did that even mean? Sometime after midnight, I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized it was different, more deliberate, a soft, rhythmic scratching sound, coming from just outside the cabin walls. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen. The scratching continued, moving slowly around the perimeter of the cabin, like something was circling us, testing the boundaries. I sat up in bed, my breath shallow. I wanted to wake Derek, but I was too afraid to move, too afraid to acknowledge what I was hearing. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and then, for a moment, it stopped. I held my breath, waiting, praying that it was over. But then, I heard it again, this time from inside the cabin. It was faint at first, a soft rustling sound coming from the living room. I stared at the door, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly, I got out of bed and crept to the door, opening it just a crack. The living room was dark, the only light coming from the dying embers of the fire. But there, in the shadows, I saw movement. A figure, tall, thin and hunched, was standing by the window, its back to me. It was scratching at the glass, its long, bony fingers making a horrible screeching sound. I froze, my body trembling with fear. The figure's head slowly turned, its face hidden in the shadows, and then, in the faint glow of the firelight, I saw its eyes, glowing, red, and filled with malice. I slammed the door shut and backed away, my mind racing. I needed to get Derek. I needed to get out of this cabin. But before I could move, I heard the sound of the front door creaking open. I held my breath, listening as heavy footsteps echoed through the cabin. Whatever was out there, it was inside now. It was supposed to be a routine camping trip, just me and my brother, Peter, heading out to the secluded woods where we'd spent summers as kids. It had been years since we'd been back, and we were both looking forward to some peace and quiet, away from the chaos of city life. These woods had always been a sanctuary for us, a place to escape the noise and stress of the world. But from the moment we arrived, something felt off. The forest looked the same, dense, dark, and sprawling. But there was something wrong with the air. It felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us, weighing on our lungs. Even the light seemed different, more muted, like the trees were swallowing it up before it could reach the ground. I chalked it up to nerves. We hadn't been camping in a while, and I figured my mind was just playing tricks on me. Peter seemed to sense it too, but we didn't talk about it. We found the old creek without too much trouble. It was one of our favorite spots as kids, isolated, surrounded by thick trees, with a clear view of the stars once the sun set. We set up camp quickly, eager to get the fire going and settle into the familiar rhythm of the woods. For a while, everything felt normal. We roasted hot dogs, drank a few beers, and laughed about the dumb stuff we used to do as kids. But as the sun dipped lower and the shadows stretched out longer, that uneasy feeling crept back in. The forest, usually alive with the sounds of insects, birds and rustling leaves, had fallen silent. Not just quiet, silent. It was like the entire world had pressed pause, waiting for something to happen. "You hear that?" Peter asked, breaking the silence. I frowned, listening intently. "No, I don't hear anything." "Exactly." He looked around, his eyes scanning the darkening tree line. "It's too quiet." I tried to laugh it off. "Come on, man. It's the woods. Sometimes it's quiet." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. This wasn't normal. There should have been sounds, crickets, owls, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. But there was nothing, just the crackle of the fire and the steady thrum of my own heartbeat. We sat there in uneasy silence for a while, both of us too stubborn to admit we were spooked. The sun had fully set by then, and the forest around us was swallowed in darkness. The firelight only reached so far, casting long shadows that danced on the trees, making the woods feel even more oppressive. Then we heard it, a soft rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. It was distant at first, but it grew louder, closer. I tensed, my eyes darting toward the sound, but I couldn't see anything beyond the flickering edge of the firelight. "You hear that?" Peter asked again, his voice tight. This time, I nodded. "Probably just a deer," I said, though I didn't believe it. The rustling was too deliberate, too slow, like whatever it was taking its time, watching us. Peter grabbed the flashlight and stood up, shining it toward the trees. "Let's check it out," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. We moved cautiously toward the sound, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. The rustling stopped. For a moment, everything was still again, unnaturally still. My pulse pounded in my ears as I strained to see through the trees, but there was nothing there, just shadows and the quiet rustling of leaves in the faint breeze. "I don't like this," Peter muttered, lowering the flashlight. "Me neither. Let's go back to the fire." We turned and walked back to the camp, trying to shake off the creeping dread that had settled over us. But as we sat down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The darkness seemed thicker now, more oppressive, and the silence, it felt wrong. That's when we saw them. Two figures, pale and thin, stepped out from the shadows of the trees, just at the edge of the clearing. They were human-shaped, but wrong, too tall, their limbs too long, their skin a sickly white that almost seemed to glow in the firelight. Their eyes were black, hollow, and fixed on us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Peter swore under his breath, taking a step back. "What the hell?" The figures didn't move. They just stood there, staring at us. I wanted to look away, to break the spell of their gaze, but I couldn't. There was something hypnotic about them, something that held me in place. "We need to leave," I whispered, my voice barely audible. My heart was pounding so hard, I could feel it in my throat. Peter nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, now." We scrambled to gather our things, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the tent zipper. The pale figures didn't move, but their presence was suffocating, like the air around them was charged with something dangerous. My stomach churned with fear, and my mind raced with questions I didn't want answers to. As we hurried to the car, I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder. The figures were still there, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us with those hollow, empty eyes. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but their presence was enough to send chills racing down my spine. We threw our gear into the trunk and jumped into the car, slamming the doors shut. Peter fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he dropped them twice before finally getting the car started. "Go! Go! Go!" I urged, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. The figures were still standing there, motionless, but I could feel their gaze burning into my back. Peter floored the gas, and the car lurched forward, kicking up dirt as we sped down the narrow dirt road. My hands were clenched into fists, my nails digging into my palms, but I couldn't take my eyes off the mirror. As we rounded a bend, the figures disappeared from view, but the dread didn't lift. If anything, it grew worse. We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires. The woods seemed to close in around us, the trees leaning over the road like they were trying to trap us. After what felt like hours, we finally hit the main road. Peter exhaled loudly, his grip on the steering wheel loosening. "We're never coming back here," he muttered, his voice shaky. I nodded, still too shaken to speak. But as we drove further away, something caught my eye in the side mirror, a flicker of movement just behind the car. I turned in my seat, my heart hammering in my chest. There, standing at the edge of the road, were the pale figures. They hadn't followed us, but somehow they were there, watching us as we sped away. I didn't sleep that night, or the night after. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, those pale, thin figures with their hollow eyes, standing just at the edge of the clearing, waiting. And even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that they're still watching, waiting for us to come back. But I won't. I'm never going back to those woods, because I know deep down that they're still there, the pale ones,